Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Yvonne Kelly and I'm the co-coordinator of the Social Planning Network of Ontario's Community of Practice on equity and inclusion for low-income students and families. Our community of practice is part of the Knowledge Network for Student Wellbeing, and we have several local leadership communities of practice across Ontario working on equity and inclusion for students and families. This webcast today is the first in a series of interviews with leaders in research and individuals with experience on topics that impact lower income students and parents in our schools. We hope that you enjoy our webcast today and that you will register for our next one in February on private money in public education. And please encourage your colleagues to register for all of our upcoming webcasts as well. One of our guests for the one in February will be Dr. Sue Winton, whose critical policy research examines how education policies and policy processes support or undermine critical democratic commitments to equity, diversity, social justice, and public participation in policymaking. Right now, I'd like to introduce you and say thank you so much to our co-sponsor for this webcast, YouthRex, and Katie Rogers, who is the Knowledge Exchange Manager at YouthRex. Kathy's going to say a few words to you about YouthRex and also give you some directions for how you can send us questions for Paul at the end of the presentation, but you can do that throughout the webcast, and then we'll answer them at the Q&A on the end. Kathy.
Hi, I'm here from Youth Research and Evaluation Exchange, also known as YouthRex. We are a provincial initiative that's based at York University in Toronto, which is where we are broadcasting from today. And we are a project that focuses on making research and evaluation practices accessible and relevant to Ontario's grassroots youth sector. We do this through a variety of different types of work. We offer direct supports to youth programs in Ontario around designing, developing, and evaluating their programs. We also provide capacity building and professional development opportunities for grassroots youth workers in different communities, both in person and online. And we offer opportunities for knowledge exchange. So at YouthRex, we curate and we create resources to support youth work in a variety of communities and working with a variety of youth populations. And we create opportunities online and in person, and webinars are something that we enjoy doing, so we're really proud to be co-hosting this conversation today. So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Katie. Couldn't do it without you, and I absolutely mean that. So now I have the profound pleasure to introduce Dr. Paul Gorski. And I first met Paul about 5 years ago when he was in Toronto speaking at a noisy conference, and we'll have Paul join us now anytime. Later that year, we organized to have Paul. Hi, Paul. Welcome.
Hi. Thank you.
Later that year in 2015, actually, we brought Paul to the GTA and had him work with several school boards providing equity literacy training. He also was the guest speaker at a classism reduction conference that we held in Toronto. I followed his work ever since, and it informs much of the work that we do with the community of practice with the Knowledge Network. Paul earned his BA, his MEd, and his PhD from the University of Virginia. He is the founder of the Equity Literacy Institute and EdChange. He has spent nearly 25 years working with schools and other educational organizations around the world, building learning environments, equitable learning environments. He has taught at George Mason University, where he developed undergraduate and graduate programs in social justice and human rights. Paul has written 70 articles and written, co-written, or co-edited 12 books on various topics related to educational equity and justice. So he has a little bit of something to talk to us about today. So we're going to do a little interview to start us off before Paul gets into the meat and potatoes of the presentation. I have some questions that I just want to ask you. So Paul, when did you first know that equity work was going to be your life's work?
Well, I think it was a couple years into college. I went into college thinking I was going to make a living being a poet, and that didn't quite work out. It hasn't worked out yet. But I went into college already with an interest in issues like racism, poverty, sexism, and those sorts of things. And then took a couple of classes that cemented that interest and started getting involved in local activism. And then took a sociology of education class and read Jonathan Kozol's book, Savage Inequalities. And that sort of hooked me. And so I knew from then on that this is what I would do.
That's amazing. And as you and I have discussed many times, but even most recently, we're in some really challenging political times right here in Ontario, just as you are in the US. Many of our most vulnerable citizens are at particular risk given the imminent rollbacks on things like the minimum wage, basic labor standards, upcoming changes to our social assistance system, recent announcement of the cancellation of the Office of the Children's Advocate, the leaders in the governing party questioning the legitimacy of gender identity, and anticipated assaults on public education. So do you find the current political climate in the US poses even greater threat to the work that you're doing? And what advice can you give us for the work that lies ahead for us?
Well, definitely, I think that it introduces some new challenges. But one thing that I notice, I feel like for people who are themselves marginalized, whether they are people of color or people who are economically marginalized or whatever, what's happening now, I think, is a little less surprising than it is for people who are okay, have some privilege and are sort of suddenly responding to these things as like, oh my gosh, there's like these new things. In a way, I think this is just a continuation of, and probably not, shouldn't be that big of a surprise considering, things that have always sort of been in place. So, but I do think what's really important in a time like this, especially for people who are interested in equity and justice, is to make sure that we don't get sucked into conversations about things like neoliberal school reforms that are happening in ways that are falsely framed around equity and justice when they're really about redistributing resources up the economic continuum. But I see a lot of people who are, see themselves as equity people getting sucked into that. So I think we have to make sure, to me, this is just a reminder of how important it is to maximize the integrity and the transformative potential of the equity and justice work that we're doing.
Okay, well, we have some tough times ahead, but I agree with you. I think those who have always been most marginalized are less surprised, and I think it's good that it's becoming more top of mind for the rest of us. You're about to talk to us about how we can incorporate equity literacy in our work with students and parents, as well as how to affect broader structural and social change, which is what I think a lot of us are more interested in. Knowing that a very diverse and cross-sectoral audience has joined us today on this webcast, educators, administrators, parents, students, community organizers, social policy researchers, and professors, can you share with us one key element of affecting long-lasting and sustainable change? And I know you can do that in 30 seconds, so.
I think the key element is really ideological. I think in education, probably one of our biggest blocks in education is that we tend to be very practice and initiative oriented. It's like we just implement stuff and hope that if we throw enough things at the problem, if there's educational disparities around class, well, let's just throw grit at that, or growth mindset, or social emotional learning. And and none of those, by the way, can have any impact on those disparities. But I think that we're so focused on practice, like just give me 5 strategies, that often what we don't do is the ideological work. If we do the ideological work to understand more deeply why the disparities exist, then we will, we'll just naturally develop practices that will address the problem. But there are still a lot of people who are working on these issues who have these ideological blocks, who think that we can fix outcome disparities by fixing low-income families instead of fixing the conditions that marginalize low-income families, or fixing the conditions that result in the existence of low-income families. So I think putting, having the humility to put those ideological shifts, to prioritize those, and then build our practice off of those. I think that, to me, that's the most critical thing, and that's the thing that I see the most resistance against.
And I think it requires a very broad consciousness. So maybe that's why it's so resisted. But I would agree. And a last question. As an SPNO community of practice, we don't shy away from tough subjects. We challenge accepted dogma on topics such as parent engagement and fundraising. And we try to provoke learning and discussion by interrupting commonly accepted practices, such as the increasing reliance on private money in public education, another plug for our next webcast, or the critique of parents who are seemingly not as involved in their children's education as they should be. You have never taken the easy road, Paul. You've challenged the culture of poverty paradigm that continues to permeate and inform thinking about families in poverty even after it's been disproven. School practices and even funding initiatives aimed at helping people in poverty. And you've most recently taken on the narrative around grit, ideology, and growth mindset, not being the magic cure-alls for working with children in poverty. So tell us your secret.
Well, I do want to say, in terms of me not taking the difficult road, I do think that I'm, just thinking about identities. I think my whiteness and my maleness and some of my other privileged identities protect me a little bit from the kind of backlash that women and people of color and women of color experience when they challenge those kinds of conventions. So in that sense, it's really not a secret. It's just a privilege operating even in the context of my work. But to me, I guess I'm driven a lot by a sense of urgency. If we're going to be working on these things, let's work on them in a way that is, again, going to maximize the transformative potential of what we're doing. And I'm just really driven by that. And I'm driven by a sense of having high expectations that educators can handle a deeper, more complex conversation. In fact, that they want a deeper and more complex conversation. So if I start with that assumption, plus the sense of urgency, plus the recognition that my identities give me a sort of currency that I have to be willing to spend and redirect some of the scorn off of marginalized people and onto myself, I think that combination is what sort of lands me in my approach.
Well, that's great. And that also gives us a lot to work with as well. So as allies, we need to use our own points of privilege to be able to work and advance the efforts of others. So with that, we're going to close our interview section and we're going to move into presentation. So Paul's going to be presenting for the next 45 minutes, but while he's doing so, you can use the question box to submit online questions to us. We'll be going through those, and at the end, there'll be an opportunity for us to pose some of your questions to Paul for his answers. So with no further delay, we're going to get to the presentation.
Okay.
And just a note as well for folks who are following along, there is a document in the handout section of your control panel where you can actually download a PDF of the slides that Paul is about to present. And as Yvonne mentioned, please feel free to submit questions in the question box throughout the webinar, and there will be time at the end of the presentation for us to take those up.
Also, if you're joining us by phone, we will also make that available to you after the webcast.
Okay. Are we ready for the PowerPoint? I guess so here. So I'm not great with titles, so I just put a title up here that is basically the name of my book. I want to start just by asking people to do a little reflection around two questions. And the first question is, why are poor people poor? Now, I don't like that language, poor people. So another way to think of that is, why are people who are in poverty in poverty? Why are people who are experiencing poverty experiencing poverty? If you want to put that question in an educational context, we might ask, why do students who are experiencing poverty not do as well in school on average as their wealthier peers? So it doesn't mean that some students experiencing poverty don't do as well, but on average, we know both in Canada and in the US that by many, many measures, students experiencing poverty do not do as well on average as their wealthier peers. Now, this question goes back to what I was just mentioning about the importance of ideology and the need for us in education to get away from this common strategy, which seems to be based on just taking any possible popular framework or idea that the district next door is using, or to address class and poverty, and just implementing these things, implementing them over and over and over, and doing everything possible other than what we actually need to be doing, which is addressing the underlying inequities and injustices that create these gaps and these disparities. The reason why I start with this question as well is that when I was writing my book, one of the things I was curious about, it's not the only important thing, but it was something that I was curious about, was what were the attributes of educators that predicted whether they would be effective or ineffective teaching or working with students and families experiencing poverty. One of the things that I found when I was doing that, one of the attributes that sort of popped out as being particularly important, really came down to how you would answer these questions. And in essence, this is how it kind of panned out. If you look, let's look at that second question. Why do students experiencing poverty not do as well in school? Basically, what the research shows is that if you look at that question and your impulse for answering that question, your impulse is to immediately start thinking about things that are wrong with people experiencing poverty. So the first thing that pops into your mind is, well, they don't value education, or they don't have good role models at home, or they're not motivated. Basically, what the research shows is you probably are not going to be an effective. In fact, you are almost definitely not going to be an effective educator for low-income families. If that's your impulse, if your impulse is immediately to think of, to attribute educational disparities to the cultures, the values, the belief systems of people experiencing poverty, basically you got no shot at being an effective educator. And if you think about that, that makes perfect sense. Like, how can you think somebody's culture or mindset is broken and still have high expectations for that student, or still build a positive relationship with that family? On the flip side of that, what the research also has shown is that if you look at that second question and your impulse for answering that is about challenges and barriers. Here are the challenges and barriers students experiencing poverty cope with outside of school that impact their experience in school. Or here are the challenges and barriers low-income families experience in school. If your impulse is what are the challenges and barriers, that is perhaps the best predictor that you'll be effective as an educator for students and families experiencing poverty. And so the thing I want you to think about there is really that's purely ideological. The most important baseline piece is purely ideological. It's not about, I have these 5 strategies. It's not about, here's my pedagogical approach. Of course, those things are important, but the most important thing is ideology. And although that sounds sort of very heady and perhaps a little vague, it's actually in a way very practical when it comes to thinking about things like professional development, or how do I prepare myself to be an equitable educator. Because what we know about all of that is that it really needs to focus on ideology first, that there is no set of curricular or pedagogical strategies that is going to enable a teacher who starts out with a deficit ideology about families experiencing poverty. There is no pedagogical or curricular set of strategies that can make that educator an effective educator for low-income students. Doesn't matter how many practical strategies we give, it starts ideologically. And the ideology is also important just in terms of how it informs policy. Because one thing I see at a lot of schools is a lot of policy that is based on a complete misunderstanding of the realities of people experiencing poverty, or that can actually punish disproportionately punish people experiencing poverty. And one great example of this, by the way, is the use of after-school suspension as a punishment for students. That after-school suspension actually, as a punishment, has a way harsher impact on low-income families than it has on other families because of transportation limitations, work schedules, and everything else. If I don't have an ideological approach that allows me to even take something like that into consideration, I wouldn't even be able to recognize that as a problem. So we start with ideology. Now, the way that I know, excuse me, the way that I learned myself that people in poverty are not the problem from a very young age was that my people are Appalachian coal miners. My mom's family, and this is my mom's mom that you see here, my grandma Wilma, are Appalachian coal miners. And so I grew up with all these stereotypes, being fed all these stereotypes that didn't even really fit my own experience or my own family's experience. Like I heard people experiencing poverty don't value education. But my grandma was the valedictorian of her graduating class in this poor Appalachian coal mining town. So somebody there was valuing education. Granted, there were only 12 people in her graduating class, but that's still like top 9%, so that's still pretty good. I heard people experiencing poverty are violent, and I just didn't see that. I mean, I know there's violence in all kinds of communities, but I just didn't see that in this community. I heard that think for instance, if you've ever had an authority figure say something to you like, you can achieve whatever you want if you just work hard enough. Just this sort of baseline bootstraps mentality. You can achieve whatever you want if you just work hard enough. Even that never made sense to me as a kid because my people were coal miners. They were coal miners. So what you're actually saying to me when you say that is if my people who were coal miners just worked harder as coal miners, then they could have maybe not been in poverty. And of course, that's ludicrous. They were coal miners. These were not lazy people. They were coal miners. They were farmers. They were subsistence farmers. And so I knew from a very young age that discourse was just completely a false discourse. And again, that's ideological. Even some of the most equity-minded people I know are still sort of really stuck in this bootstraps mentality. And that's why things like grit are becoming popular and growth mindset is becoming popular. And these things that are about focused on student effort. It's all about effort. It's all about effort. Well, no, it's not all about effort because all else, if all else is equal, maybe it's about effort, but all else is not equal in terms of what kind of healthcare people have access to, in terms of what kind of leisure time people have access to, in terms of what kind of, access to tutors and those sorts of things. So we really have to learn how to look at this through a different ideological lens. And nothing is going to change until we do that ideological work, both as individuals, also as institutions. So I, along with my colleague Katie Swalwell, developed this framework called equity literacy. And really this is about how do we strengthen our literacy around equity? So how do we strengthen those ideological lenses so that we can see more clearly what challenges and difficulties we're up against and then come up with some strategies for that. So we sort of think about equity literacy around two questions. The first question is, what are the knowledge and skills I need to become a threat to the existence of inequity in my sphere of influence? In other words, what are the knowledge and skills I need so when I walk into this classroom, or I walk into this school, or this district office, or this nonprofit educational organization, what are the knowledge and skills I need so that my presence there is a threat to the existence of racism, is a threat to the existence of class inequity, is a threat to the existence of sexism? What are the knowledge and skills I need so I can see those things operating, and then I can eliminate those things? And this goes back to that ideological piece as well. And in essence, equity work, if I could just break it down to its simplest steps, equity work is about identifying how inequity and injustice are operating within a system or a society or a world, identifying them as clearly as possible, and then eliminating them. That's what equity work is. But I think the tendency, again, is to come up with every possible strategy or initiative or concept that creates the illusion that we're working on equity while we're not actually doing anything at all to identify and eliminate inequity. And again, I think those are things like grit, growth mindset, those sorts of things. So what are the knowledge and skills I need to be a threat to the existence of inequity? Not what are the knowledge and skills I need to be culturally competent, although that can be part of the picture. Not what are the knowledge and skills I need to celebrate diversity, although that can also be part of the picture. But in and of themselves, cultural competence and celebrating diversity do not do the work of identifying and eliminating injustice, right? So what are the knowledge and skills I need to identify and eliminate injustice? And then the second question is, do I have the will to be the threat? Do I have the will? Because I know people who have the knowledge and skills, but who don't have the will. And unfortunately, the knowledge and skills aren't very useful if I don't have the will to use them. And I want to say just one last time here, I do recognize that as a white, male, cisgender, heterosexual identifying person, in some ways it's easy for me to talk about having the will because I don't get punished in the same way that my colleagues of color or women colleagues or LGBTQ colleagues or transgender colleagues or other colleagues with marginalized identities. I don't face the same repercussions for doing this work than they do. So again, to me, that's just another reason why I have to maximize the integrity of what I'm doing. And I can't fall back on my privilege to allow me to fluff this up or to fall back into maybe a cultural competence approach because that's more comfortable for me, or a celebrating diversity approach because that protects my privilege while creating the illusion that I care about equity. It's really about having the will to honestly identify, call out the inequity, the injustice, and then work to eliminate the injustice. And again, this is not just a list of practical strategies. This is really about creating a lens. It's about creating a lens and then sifting everything we do through that lens. Another way of thinking about this is that, I sort of think about three ingredients, and one is sort of goodwill or the desire for justice. But having the desire for justice in and of itself is not enough. Having the desire for justice plus the depth of knowledge, which is what we're going to be working on in the rest of this presentation. The depth of knowledge. How does inequity and injustice operate in systems, in a classroom, in a school, in a district or school board, or in a society? How does it operate? And then also, how do we cultivate more equity and justice? That depth of knowledge, again, I think is something that too often is missing. And then if you add to that the will, and thinking about will as commitment to action, not just commitment to belief, commitment to action, I think that gets us to a possibility of equity. But again, I think too often we sort of, and too often what I see is people thinking, well, if I just have good intentions, then that will take care of the rest of this. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. So what we're going to work on for the rest of this session is really talk about that middle piece, that depth of action. That depth of knowledge that can inform the commitment to action. So thinking about taking an equity view, let's start just by talking about, well, what is inequity? If we want to create more equity and justice for economically marginalized families, What is inequity? I think of inequity as unfair or inequitable distribution of access and opportunity. Now, when I think about this, sometimes I think about material access. These are things that cost money. So that could be access to a tutor, access to summer enrichment programs, access to piano lessons. It could be access to technology. It could be access to the internet. It could be access to a house full of books. So that sort of material access and opportunity. But it can also be non-material access. So I want you to think about this in terms of your own school, your own sphere of influence, your own district or school board. Think about this. Does every student in your school or your district or school board, does every student have access to the highest level pedagogy? If you're doing any kind of tracking or any kind of ability grouping, big chances are the answer to that is absolutely they do not. So even something that is as basic as the most engaging pedagogy, the most effective teaching, in most schools, even that's not distributed fairly. Because often we're segregating students to begin with, and then that segregation often happens, we pretend that it happens around ability, but often disproportionately it happens around race and class and home language and disability and those sorts of things. So that can be an example. Or how is access to a curriculum that reflects my reality or people like me? How is that distributed in your school? Or how is access to a learning environment whose policy is built around my realities rather than some fake sort of middle class standard reality? Like, in whose image is policy being created? Is that being distributed fairly? Right. So it's really more than just material resources. It's really about how we distribute opportunity based on what's happening in the system, what's happening in policy and practice and those sorts of things. So if that's inequity, then what is equity? Equity is about redistributing access and opportunity. So what does it take to do that? It takes looking at every policy and asking, in whose image is this policy created? It's about looking at every practice and asking myself, how is this practice going to impact the most marginalized students? And a great example of this, and I don't know if this is happening as much in Canada or in the Ontario region, but in the United States, one thing that is very popular now is for schools to adopt these online platforms for communicating with families and posting assignments and turning in homework, so all the communication is done online. And if you just ask yourself, well, who is that for? Who is that decision, and whose image was that decision made? Then I think it generally can become pretty clear that if that was a solution that was adopted in your school, then that was a decision that is going to help the people who already have the most access. It's not a decision that's going to help the people who have the least access, who are least likely to have the technology at home to be able to use this online portal, right? So it's about, creating this lens. So when somebody says, oh, we're thinking about going to this online portal, I can say, I wonder how that's going to impact our most economically marginalized families, because the negative impact it potentially could have on them is bigger than the positive impact it's going to have on everyone else, especially when I consider all of the inequities that those lower income families are already experiencing. So it's about redistributing access and opportunity by changing policy, by changing practice, by rethinking the system itself through a lens of equity and justice. I think some of the troubles with thinking about equity in this way, again, is that generally, to me, it seems like there's a tendency to detour around equity by implementing what we call equity initiatives that have nothing to do with equity. And I've talked about grit and growth mindset already, I think there are some examples of the ways schools are talking about social emotional learning that do this. I think even something like even something like an example I often use is focusing on learning styles, which is such a weird thing because the whole idea of learning styles has been completely debunked. But often schools are sort of adopting, that as a strategy. So oftentimes when I'm working with schools, when I go in and look at what they're doing, it looks to me like what they're really prioritizing are the optics of equity. So we can point to, well, we have this growth mindset initiative, or we have this, it's about initiatives that we have over actual equity efforts. Like, here are the ways we've identified how racism is operating in this school and eliminated the racism from this school. To me, it's so often less about that and more about, well, here is our Celebrating Diversity initiative. So we got to make sure that we don't get sucked into that. Another way to think about this is that thinking about outcome inequalities, which are often sort of the focus. I think that's a limited focus when we're talking about equity, but it's the way that people often focus things like grades and graduation rates and those sorts of things. Another sort of approach that has been really popular, has been popular in Canada and the US, also in other places, is the culture or mindset of poverty. And again, this is about creating the optics. We can say, well, we're doing this workshop about the culture of poverty. So it creates the optics that we're doing something, but without actually doing anything about equity. And of course, the problem with the culture of poverty or the mindset of poverty is that these outcome inequalities do not result from supposed cultural defects in low-income families. There's no evidence that any of those defects, cultural defects, or lack of grittiness, or attitudinal problems, that those exist in low-income families any more than they exist in other families. So, and by the way, this whole culture of poverty or mindset of poverty, that idea was debunked in the late 1960s. We've known since 1968 that there is no such thing as a culture of poverty or mindset of poverty. That was something that was just made up, in essence, based on small studies in Mexican and Puerto Rican communities, and then extrapolated as though there's this universal culture of poverty or mindset of poverty. Right, and that still today is the dominant way people talk about poverty in class. The problem is what the cultural or mindset of poverty approach completely ignores is that these outcome disparities actually can be tracked back entirely to inequitable access to resources and experiences in school and out of school. Right, so if we want to address the disparities, what we have to do is focus on those inequities outside of school and inside of school. There's no way we could do that by fixing the cultures and the mindsets of people experiencing poverty. So if we're doing that, we're contributing to the problem that we're trying to fix. I'm going to show you another example of that in a second. So the equity literacy framework is based around these 4 skills. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. I'm just going to mention them quickly, and then we're going to sort of work on this, especially the ideological piece, which is the recognizing inequities. Sort of 4 skills. The first one is just being able to recognize inequity. Would you recognize it if you saw it? If you picked up let's say a history textbook and it had subtle biases about families experiencing poverty in it, would you recognize those? Or if you looked at a policy, if somebody said we're going to go to an online portal for communicating with parents, would you recognize that? Would you immediately recognize that as a problem. If you couldn't recognize that as a problem, there's no way you could do something about it. So the first skill is just learning how to recognize how inequity operates, even in its subtle ways. We're going to talk about some examples of that in 1 second. The second is the ability to respond to inequity. Respond to inequity. So in the moment, again, somebody says we're going to this online portal. Do you recognize that as an inequity, and do you have the will to say something like, I wonder how that's going to impact our most marginalized families? Or if you recognize that this in a school-based policy, do you have the will to say something about it and to engage people in a conversation and to fight back against inequitable policy and practice? The third is redressing inequity. And this is sort of the deeper level version of respond. Redressing means I need to actually see how this is operating in the system, how this is woven into the system. If all it is I'm saying, if I'm just sort of waiting to find this policy or this practice, we can't really make the progress we want to make as quickly as we want to make it. So it's about redressing the inequity, seeing the patterns of inequity. Because if you have one policy that's marginalizing low-income families or families of color or whoever it is, chances are a lot of your policies are doing that. So I have to learn to see how that operates as a sort of pattern. And then finally, the ability to sustain equity. Because once we start making progress and change those policies and practices, then what happens is the people who have a sense of entitlement to having more access and opportunity are going to start complaining. And we have to be able to sustain our efforts even against the resistance. So let's go back to that idea of recognizing. I want to give you 2 examples. One's a gender example and one's a race example. And then we'll talk about some class and poverty examples. So there's a whole bunch of research about how teachers treat students differently based on perceived gender. In other words, how the teacher perceives the gender of the student. So you all know a lot of this, I'm sure, but for instance, teachers tend to call on boys or young men more than they call on girls or young women, or at least students they're interpreting as boys or interpreting as girls. But there's this other example about how teachers tend to compliment students based on perceived gender. And what that shows is that when teachers compliment young men, they're most likely to compliment them on something to do with their intelligence. Like, you're a great speller, or you're an awesome poet, or great job on that science test, When teachers compliment young women, they're most likely to compliment them on their appearance. So while boys are hearing things like, aren't you smart, or good job on that test, or that's a great essay, the average compliment girls or young women are hearing is, oh, doesn't your hair look pretty today? Oh, don't you look nice today? Oh, I really like your shoes. The average compliment. And so to me, the question, so obviously that's sexism. That's an example of sexism. So the question in terms of recognizing, let's say that you were observing a colleague teaching for a week, and that colleague was doing that, had that pattern. Would you notice that? Would you notice that, or is that so normalized that you wouldn't even notice it? And before you say, yes, of course I would notice that, another way I could ask you that is, have you noticed that? Because if you work in a school, that kind of thing is happening around you all the time. So you can't say that you would notice it if you have not in the past noticed it. So that's about recognizing, how am I going to make that more equitable if I don't even see it happening right in front of me? Another example, this is from a study about how it's a study in US high schools about how teachers interact with students differently based on race outside of formal instructional time. And basically what it finds is that when teachers approach white students outside of formal instructional time, so before class, after class, in the hallway, that sort of thing. When a teacher approaches a white student and just strikes up a conversation, they're most likely to strike up a conversation about schoolwork, right? So How is that assignment coming along? Are you ready for the exam? That sort of thing. If the student is Black, the teacher strikes up a conversation. What do you think they're most likely to strike up a conversation about? I bet you all know this. And I bet right now you all are thinking sports. And you are correct. That's correct. And that is an example of racial bias. That's an example of racism. So again, ask yourself, especially if you haven't been the target of that kind of racism, is that the sort of thing that you've recognized? Is that the sort of thing that you recognize? If you can't recognize it, and again, maybe that specific thing is not happening in the school that you work in, but that kind of thing is happening in every school. So the question is, could I recognize it? How could I make it more equitable? If I could learn to recognize that, then I might recognize policy, then I might recognize practice, then I might recognize how some of these big neoliberal school reforms that are being framed as though they're about equity are actually creating more inequity. So let's go back to class and poverty, since that's our central focus here. One of the things that I've been doing is interviewing families that are experiencing poverty about this idea of what are called micro humiliations, just these little sort of nagging everyday little humiliations. This sort of comes out of the language of microaggressions and race. And one of the forms of microaggressions has been called microhumiliations. So think about just the little policies and practices, everyday policies and practices that might humiliate students or families experiencing poverty. So I've been interviewing families, and two of the things that I had years ago I hadn't really thought of. One was the scholastic, these book fairs that schools have, where you kind of march students through the book fair, and students who can afford to buy a book will buy a book, and students who can't won't buy a book. And just this little example of a thing, like every year I get marched through this thing. I can't afford to buy a book, and it's humiliating. And then it's humiliating for parents, because then the students are going back to their parents saying, well, everyone else bought a book, why can't we buy a book? And so these sort of things that we create, chocolate bar fundraisers, where whoever sells the most chocolate bars, gets some sort of prize at the end. Another example of this. But if you think about, and I'll just give you a few seconds right now, if you just think about this, there are all sorts of these little micro humiliations operating in schools, just these little things that happen that humiliate students experiencing poverty. And you can also do a similar exercise around race, or around language, or around religion, or around disability, or around any of these other issues. But the last thing I'll say about this is, it's not just about recognizing each individual one. If I think about just one of these things, like the book fair, I might think, well, that's happening once a year. I don't really see the big deal. But it's really about the accumulation of those things over time that happen over and over and over and over. And the accumulation of those humiliations, which creates this sense like, well, this system was not built for me at all. You all have no idea what my life was like. And what I find really frustrating is that we'll set up these systems that have, where a very reasonable result of the way that system is created is sending the message to low-income students and families that, this system isn't really created for them. So when they start to feel disconnected and disconnect, then we use that as proof of our existing stereotypes about how they value education, when the reality really isn't about how they value education, but really about how we value equity. Right? And so it's really important to create a really clear lens about this, so we can make sure we're not contributing to the problems that we're actually trying to solve. So you can do it, we're not going to do this exercise right now, but you can think about this. What is an example of a policy or a practice you have observed in a school that could unintentionally humiliate or embarrass students experiencing poverty? anybody who wants to, if you have access to the questions or the chat box, and you want to put something in there about that, just to practice that. And then you can say, what, and then, to be more solutions oriented, you might say, well, what could we do differently to avoid that humiliation? And a lot of teachers, by the way, are already doing just some things that really aren't that hard. One example of this is, teachers who recognize that it's humiliating for some students that some of their classmates can afford that 64 box of Crayola crayons with the low sharpener on the back, and all I can afford are these generic grocery store brand, 8 box of crayons. So every time the teacher says, take out your crayons, it's just this little micro humiliation, right? So a lot of teachers, what they do is they just collect all the crayons, pour them into community bins, and then they're community crayons. And now we don't have to do that little dance of humiliation. And so, sometimes it's about little changes like that. Sometimes it's about looking more broadly at a pattern of the way that policies and practices have this negative impact. Another way you can think about this is thinking about costs and expenses for families who have children in schools. So I think about this in terms of 3 categories. And again, if you work in a school, or if you work for in the US, what we call a school district, in Ontario, what you call a school board, this is an exercise you could do. Just list all the costs and expenses. What are the things that families with children in public schools, what are the things that they're required to pay for? That might be school supplies, it might be clothes, it might be multiple different kinds of shoes, it might be, all those sorts of things. And so each one of those is a little stressor for low-income families. But then think about non-required costs. If that I don't have to pay for this, but if I do pay for this, my child will get more access and opportunity. So maybe that's something like, well, if I can pay for a musical instrument, my child will have access to more music education. If I can afford a graphing calculator, my child will have a better shot at doing better in advanced level math. If I can afford tutors, if I can afford piano lessons, if I, on and on and on and on, non-required costs and expenses. By the way, the ways that these operate in schools, there should never be a situation in a public school where a student's family can pay more money and get that student more access to educational opportunity. That should never happen. And so again, I would say, go back to your sphere of influence and identify the ways that that's happening, even if it's a $10 fee for an extracurricular. And we got to eliminate those things. That's an example of an inequity. Finally, there are socially pressured costs and expenses. So these are the sorts of things where these don't really have any bearing on my learning, but I get some social benefit for being able to afford these things. So that might be something like attending formal dances. It might be something like affording a yearbook, or being able to go to a school play, or it might be any sort of cost. It might be something like buying a class hoodie or a school hoodie or any kind of school clothes or anything like that. So and again, it's what you want to do is think about these individually, but also thinking about the accumulation of them, the accumulation of these experiences that create, as we look at the accumulation, bigger and bigger advantage for families that have economic resources and bigger disadvantage for those who don't, right? And the ways that these operate in schools, we have to be committed to eliminating those. Now, I want to talk about 2 helpful concepts that might sort of be able, that might give us some additional tools for doing exercises like that and improving the conditions in our own schools. I want to talk about poverty ideologies. I want to talk about the difference between mitigative change and transformative change. So let's start with poverty ideologies. These are based on research about how educators make sense out of educational outcome disparities. And generally, scholars who look at this sort of thing have identified three ideological positions. One is called deficit ideology, one is called grit ideology, one is called structural ideology. So let's talk about why this is important. So why, again, just one last piece about why ideology is important. And I want to give a race example here because I think it's, well, in some ways I think it's nonsensical to talk about poverty without also talking about race. So a study in the US from the Department of Education found that in the US, African American students are disciplined at far higher rates than white students. And they were much more likely to be suspended or expelled than white students. Now, if I were to address this as an equity and justice issue, as a racism issue, I have to understand why this is happening. And what has happened, and I'm sure this is the same in parts of Canada as well, that the most popular solutions for this in the US have tended to be solutions that are about fixing the behaviors of African American students. So behavior modification strategies. The problem is that if you look at research about why this exists, this actually exists not because of the behaviors of African American students, but because of the racial bias of white teachers. So there's no way to address this without addressing the racial bias of white teachers. Basically, there are two things operating. One is that white teachers interpret the behaviors of Black students more harshly than the same behaviors in white students. So they're much more likely to interpret a behavior as aggressive if the student is Black, where if a white student had that same behavior, would not be interpreted that way. Also, when white students misbehave, on average, white teachers do not attribute that to their race. They're not like, oh, these white students keep misbehaving. But implicitly, for white teachers, if African American students misbehave, they're implicitly attributing that to their race. What that means in the long term is that African American students are often punished, in essence, for the accumulation of behaviors of African American students. And that's where that school to prison pipeline comes from. And again, this is purely ideological. If I look at that discipline data, and my assumption is, well, of course they misbehave more. No, of course they misbehave more, so we have to fix their behavior. Then I'm going to adopt strategies that have no shot at improving conditions. If I look at that and I say, well, I wonder how our policies and practices are actually creating this, now that allows for me to create equitable solutions. So that first view is called deficit ideology. If you go back to that first question I asked, why are low-income students not doing as well in school? If your impulse was, here are things that are wrong with low-income people, what that means is that you have a deficit ideology when it comes to poverty. So deficit ideology is believing that outcome inequalities are caused by so-called deficiencies in low-income communities and individuals. So again, if that's my ideological perspective, my solutions are going to be about fixing people's mindsets, or fixing low-income people's cultures, fixing low-income people's behaviors, fixing low-income people's mindsets, those sorts of things. There is no possible way to get to equity through a deficit view. And in order to have a deficit view, you have to just pretend that inequities don't exist outside of school or inside of school. So that's deficit ideology. Grit ideology is, I might recognize that there are some barriers and challenges and inequities, but instead of removing the barriers and the inequities, my strategy is to focus on cultivating grit and resilience in low-income students. Now, I'm a little bit short on time, so I'm not going to share that sexual assault example, but I will just say that a big problem with the grit view is that our lowest income students are already our grittiest and most resilient students. they're already the ones who are dealing with the most barriers and still somehow getting to school and being engaged in school. So it's ridiculous just on face value. And really, you have to have a deficit view to believe that grit as an approach can create lead to equity. So what we want is called the structural view, structural ideology. Structural ideologies, first, we recognize that people experiencing poverty have much to overcome in school and out of schools in order to succeed. So we identify, here are the barriers. Here is the way class inequity, economic injustice is operating in schools. Here's the way it's operating outside of schools. And then we go about eliminating the barriers. If there are barriers that exist outside of school that have to do with access to healthcare, access to living wage work, those sorts of things, I might not be able to completely eliminate those barriers, but I certainly can rethink what I'm doing in light of those barriers. So if you think about the issue of something like family involvement, when people have surveyed low-income families about why they're less likely to visit their children's school, their reasons sort of fall into two buckets. One of the buckets has to do with access and opportunity, which is, I don't have transportation, I work multiple jobs, I don't have paid leave, I can't afford childcare, those sorts of things. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's awfully sad, but that's kind of outside the spheres of influence of schools. So you might not be able to completely eliminate, as an educator, you might not be able to eliminate the barrier of lack of transportation. But you can think of, well, how do we do family involvement in a way that prioritizes participation for the people who are least likely to have transportation? Maybe we rethink where we have it. Maybe we provide transportation. So still the structural view helps. The other bucket is really about how people are treated when they do visit their kids' school. Now, all schools can have complete control over that. We can do professional development. We can hold people accountable for being, if they're condescending to or oppressive to lower income families. But I have to have that if I don't have the structural view and I look at the information that says, well, low-income families are less involved at school, I might presume, well, they just don't value education, which might make me less likely to want to rethink the way I do things, to do them in a way that's more accessible. But if I come from a structural view, my impulse is, well, what are the challenges and barriers that might make it harder for low-income families to do that, and how can I remove the barriers? So I want to, as an example of this, I don't know if this link is going to work. Okay. I just want to show you one example of deficit ideology. And for anybody who has been in any of my workshops, you've probably seen this before. But this is an example that comes right out of the work of Ruby Payne, who is generally still today considered the primary purveyor of deficit ideology in the United States. So hopefully you all can see this. Uh-oh. Oh no. Okay. Well, it looks like it's frozen up a little bit, but so if you haven't seen this, we basically have 3 checklists. One is, could you survive in poverty? One is, could you survive in middle class down here? And here, could you survive in wealth? Okay. So, so this is from Ruby Payne's work. If you look at these 3 checklists, I think the first thing to do is to look at this question, could you survive in wealth? And if you just look at that, you can see how asinine this whole exercise is. Could I survive in wealth? I mean, that's kind of a ridiculous question, but I want you to see how we're tricked into the deficit ideology. Now, we have sort of 3 checklists here that suggest that what's happening is that there are just 3 cultural groups: people in poverty, middle class people, wealthy people. That we just have 3 cultural groups, and that all we need to do is help the people experiencing poverty develop the habits of the middle class people or the wealthy people. But these are not just three groups. These are three groups that have vastly different levels of access and opportunity, that face, around their economic status, face very different levels of access and opportunity and oppression and inequity. But that's not allowed for here. This just suggests that these are three equal groups, which obviously they are not. But what I want you to look at is, if you look at the Could You Survive in Poverty, you can see items that actually contribute to a deficit view of people experiencing poverty, that actually contribute to a notion of criminality or a notion of violence in people experiencing poverty, like, for instance, these three items. Now, I don't know the data in Canada, but I do know in the US that research shows that wealthy people are just as likely to commit crime as people experiencing poverty. The problem is, if I go into the Could You Survive in Wealth list, there's no mention of that anywhere. There are no items, and this is deficit ideology. That there are these deficit views applied to low-income people, but if I go to the wealthy people, I don't see any of those things being addressed, right? That's classic deficit ideology. There's nothing negative, even though wealthy people are just as likely to be criminals, just as likely to be jackasses of any kind. There's nothing that allows for that in their list, but on the people experiencing poverty list, we're basically criminalizing poverty. So being able to recognize stuff like that, even in professional development models, is really important. Another useful exercise just about thinking about barriers is think about sort of the everyday things that happen in schools, like everyday expectations, completing homework, maintaining a perfect attendance record. Another way to sort of exercise our equity literacy and our understanding of deficit and structural ideology is to think about, for instance, can you think about an example of a situation in which a low-income student who maybe isn't completing their homework on a regular basis, is there any way to imagine a situation in which a student is making a responsible decision to not complete their homework, instead of just jumping to the assumption that that student is being irresponsible? Can you think of an example, and can you rethink policy in a way that creates some space for the possibility that maybe this student is actually being responsible? So for instance, maybe I have to take care of younger siblings after school. Maybe I have to go to work to support my family after school. So maybe the most responsible decision I can make in this moment is not to do my homework. But I might be punished for not doing my homework in an equal way as wealthier kids who don't have these barriers would be punished for then not completing their homework, or maintaining a perfect attendance record, or those sorts of things. So this is just helping us practice just these everyday presumptions in schools and looking at them through a structural lens instead of looking at them through a deficit lens. The other concept is just the difference between mitigative and transformative change. I like to share this through a couple of parables. The starfish parable is, I'm sure you all know the starfish parable. There's a kid walking on the beach and there's all these dried out starfish, and the kid is throwing the starfish one by one back in the ocean. And an adult comes along and says, "You're never going to make a difference. There are thousands of starfish." So the child picks up a starfish and says, "Well, I made a difference to this one," and throws it back in the ocean. And I think part of the holdup in terms of equity work is that we're taught to think that this is how we make change. We just make these little incremental changes. So, instead of addressing sexism in STEM fields, maybe we start this club for young women who are interested in STEM. Now, that might be a good bridge to the bigger work that we have to do, and sometimes we have to do both of those things. But we want to make sure that we're not sort of leaving the inequitable structure in place and then just making little tweaks to help, a few low-income students. A transformation parable would be the one about the woman who's standing at the river and she sees a baby floating down the river. So she swims out and saves the baby. And then she sees another baby floating down the river, swims out and saves the baby. And the more times she does this, the more babies are floating down the river. And next thing you know, the whole village is down by the river and everyone's swimming out, saving babies. And that first woman starts walking up the river. And people are furious. Where are you going? We have to save the babies. And she says, well, I'm going to go find out how all these babies keep ending up in the river. So again, it's that deeper level. Let's look at, and again, I think a lot of that is really about what is the ideology that's driving our institutional practice? What are the presumptions that are driving our institutional practice? And if we could get at those, then we could create the change that's going to be transformative. And again, I've already sort of mentioned most of these, but some of the sort of mitigations, the things that people adopt because they detour around equity, grit, growth mindset. And I'll even give a shout out to Carol Dweck because she's come out publicly and said, stop using growth mindset as an equity strategy. It is not an equity strategy. I think Eric Jensen, his work on the brain stuff with people experiencing poverty, I think it's one important little strand, but it is only a little strand of a bigger picture. And by the way, studies are now finding that growth mindset interventions are not particularly effective. So it's just another in this example of, well, this is a popular concept. So let's just grab that and see if we can use it. Again, what we want to do is identify the inequities. How are the inequities operating? How do we eliminate the inequities? So I want to end by just sharing a few basic principles that can guide our process of creating more equity, and then a few sort of ideas for specific things you can work on. The first is called the direct confrontation principle. This principle says that the only path toward equity requires direct confrontations with inequity, right? How is the inequity operating? How do we eliminate the inequity? All these other things, the celebrating diversity, the cultural competence, the grit and the growth mindset, maybe they play some role in something. But if we are not identifying and eliminating inequitable policies and practices and structures and systems and transforming them, then there's no path to equity. The redistribution principle is that equity initiatives ought to be about redistributing access and opportunity, again, through changing policy and practice and other sorts of things. So if I can't describe here is how my initiatives are redistributing access and opportunity, then I need to rethink what I'm doing. The third principle is called the prioritization principle, that equity requires us to reimagine policy and practices in ways that actively prioritize the interests of historically and presently marginalized students, low-income students, students of color, English language learners, LGBTQ students, etc. So that means when we're building policy, it's not about how can we include low-income students, it's about how do we actively prioritize. Equity work is about closing the gap in access and opportunity. There's no way to do that if some people have this level of access and others have this, and I'm not actively working to prioritize the interests of these people so that the access is being redistributed. I think I've talked enough about the ideology principle, but the work has got to begin with ideology. If you have any power over professional development in your sphere of influence, you got to make sure that the equity work is not just about practical shifts, that it starts with the ideological shifts and that we develop our practical strategies through those shifts. This is my deficit ideology principle called fix injustice, not kids. That none of our equity efforts should be about fixing students experiencing poverty. They should be about fixing conditions that marginalize students experiencing poverty or that contribute to educational inequities or that contribute to economic injustice and that actually contribute to the existence of poverty itself. So I'm going to end by talking about evidence-based actions you can take right now. These are based on what are the things that are happening in high poverty, high performing schools that are actually making a difference. The first one I've talked about a lot already, but training all people, all leaders to respond to deficit ideology in all its forms. The biggest institutional block to equity around poverty is deficit ideology. So you cannot allow that to live in your sphere of influence. Anytime you see or hear any remnant of it, it has to be addressed. If you are a leader and you're skittish about addressing it, that means you are part of the problem because you are allowing deficit ideology to live. You have to name it and address it every time someone says, those parents don't value education. Every time somebody says, well, the students who don't want to learn make it hard to teach the students who do want to learn. Anytime somebody says the problem is that those kids are unmotivated, you need to initiate the conversation in a way that undoes the deficit ideology and gears the conversation toward a structural ideology. D-track and ability grouping. Right now, based on the research that we have, there is no excuse for any school to use tracking or ability grouping as a central organizing tool in the school. I understand that there are some situations for certain skills in which some amount of ability grouping might be important. But right now, what the research shows is that 95% of students do not benefit at all from tracking. The research from the mid-'80s shows that 5% of the highest achievers derive some benefit from tracking, but the new research about ability grouping shows that even the highest achievers, if they're put in mixed ability groupings, will still achieve just as high as they would have achieved if they were in a segregated ability group. So knowing all of the racism and classism and xenophobia that goes into tracking and ability grouping at this point, if you're committed to equity and you're working in a school or a district, you ought to be detracking and rethinking ability grouping right now. Rethink hiring with equity literacy in mind. You can just ask one question. If someone's interviewing for a job, why do students experiencing poverty not do as well? If that person responds with things that are wrong with people experiencing poverty, then you know that person is coming with a deficit ideology, and that person is not going to be an effective educator for really for any student, but especially for low-income students. That does not mean that person is unhirable. Maybe it just means we need to do some professional development and help shift that attitude or mindset. Right now, you can eliminate all fees attached to learning opportunities. I know some of you are thinking, well, we have this mechanism if students can't afford it, that they can come and ask and we'll give them access. But making them come and ask is itself one of those micro humiliations. If the goal of education is free, equal education, we need to stop charging fees for what is supposed to be a free and equal education. I think there was a couple more. Never for any reason allow students to be pulled out of art. Protect the arts, anything you can do to protect the arts, because we know that the arts are important for all students, but in school they're especially important for low-income students whose families often can't afford to provide them with formal arts opportunities outside of school. They can't afford to send them to drama camp or piano lessons or whatever it is. So any of these programs that pull students out of arts to give them access to other academics, that should be eliminated. To pull students out of recess as a punishment. There are very few things for which we have over 100 years of evidence that are really important for all students and actually additionally important for low-income students. These are two of those things, so you have to protect them any way you can. Analyzing building and district level policies for bias. A great place to start with this is to look at school policy handbooks and do it through that exercise of deficit and structural ideology, and also through the lens of how policy can be made to actually privilege some groups in the context compared to other groups, even if it's not done intentionally. Finally, identify and eliminate policies, programs, initiatives that punish marginalized students for ways they're already marginalized. So we can think about how we weigh homework. We can think about how we respond to tardies and absences, and some of the other things that we've talked about. If you want to expand your sphere of influence, fight for higher minimum wages. If you really are interested in justice, what we really want to fight for is income and wealth, more income and wealth, equality, advocate for affordable housing and tenants' rights. If you're in the US, advocating for universal health care and more of a focus on preventative health care, because those last three things that I named are the things that social scientists have identified as the biggest influences on educational outcome disparities. Also consider how other challenges impact families: food deserts, food insecurity, time poverty, gentrification in cities, and more. So I want to end with a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. because I think he's really speaking to this thing that is so important in the equity literacy framework, which is how do we maximize the integrity and transformative potential. And he says, I've almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block is not the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice. And then this is the piece I think really captures it, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. If we are choosing our path to equity in a way that prioritizes the comfort of privileged people over the transformation we need to make for marginalized people, then we're going at this backward. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding of people from ill will. So I start with the assumption of goodwill, add depth of understanding, and then a willingness to act on our convictions. And that's what's going to create more equity. So I guess we're ready. Thank you all for listening. And I guess we're ready for questions or comments, if anybody has those.
Joining you right away. Hi, Paul.
Hi.
We have like 100 questions, so we're going to have to be very selective. So we have a few that we want to share with you and get some of your thoughts. So the first question is from one of our parents on the call, and the question is, as a parent, do you have ideas for how to get a school on board to take a look at these types of policies that you've been talking about, redistributive policies?
Public shaming? No, I guess sometimes it comes to that, but I think I think the best thing to do is to organize a group of parents who can advocate for this collectively. I think as an individual parent, it's very easy for the school to blow you off or dismiss you. And there are actually some great parent collectives. I know that there are some in the US that are fighting back against a lot of these things. So you might want to check in your region or your state if there's already some sort of parent collective that's working on that sort of thing. And if you develop a parent collective and then maybe do like some sort of public statement about it and request a meeting, I think that's going to be a better strategy than trying to do it on your own.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have a question from an administrator. In my school, we've been working on social emotional learning and creating caring classroom community. I consider this important work, but now worry how it can contribute to inequity. Can you share your thoughts about this and recommendations for my teachers and my school?
That's a great question. And there's a woman named Dina Simmons who works at that exact intersection. You might want to look up some of her work, Dina Simmons. But yeah, to me, and I also think about what is that other thing that's really popular right now that's sort of connected to social emotional learning. It's trauma-informed practices. I don't have an issue with thinking about social emotional learning or trauma-informed practices as a framework that schools endorse. I was a kid who went to school I had a lot of emotional traumas. I'd experienced sexual abuse. I had undiagnosed learning disabilities. So I had all of this trauma, and I desperately wish that my I had more tools to deal with that, and my teachers had more tools to deal with it. So I'm not saying that you should throw that out. What I'm saying is that you should not be mistaken that that is an equity initiative. That does not replace. And the other thing from an equity point of view is my concern is that often in schools that are working on those things, to me, what it looks like is usually those are things that are pointed at marginalized students,
Yeah.
at students of color, at low-income students, at immigrants or migrants or refugees. And so the presumption is, and that way it is deficit ideology in the sense that instead of dealing with the biases and inequities they're experiencing in our school, we're just going to help them cope with the challenges they're experiencing in their lives. Now, some of those challenges might be real, and perhaps we should be in collaboration with their communities working on it. But I don't like the way that the way that it's often used as an equity strategy is that the presumption is, well, if this kid comes from a low-income family, he must have emotional issues. So in order to address the behavior of that kid, I think that's the piece that we want to avoid, is making sure that that is not replacing identifying and eliminating the inequities and engaging in more equitable practice.
Well, I think that's where it goes back to what you say, get clear on your ideology, because the strategies will come from those. So that's why we see a lot of these particular strategies, good as they are across the board and in and of themselves, should not be used to be targeted to fix certain groups of students. So even as we talked about grid ideology, the grittiest people I know are those that are living on low income. Well, I think we have time for one more question because we want to wrap up and tell people how they can access all this information. And I had this question. Okay, when doing anti-racism work in schools whose populations are predominantly white and experiencing poverty, educators will often say that the issue here is poverty, not race. Why is this such a common response, and how might we interrupt competing oppressions?
Well, it's a common response because of racism. That the desire to be let off the hook of having to talk about racism, and I face that all the time, and that's why, as you could tell, I can't. When I do these things, I always incorporate conversations about other issues as well. And I think intersectionality as a framework provides a really good framework, but I do think we need pointed attention at each of the individual issues, pointed attention at racism, pointed attention at heterosexism, pointed attention at transphobia, et cetera. But we also need intersectional attention at each of those things. And some people think intersectionality means in every conversation we have to address every oppression. But really what theoretically intersectionality means is that you put one oppression at the center, and then in order to more deeply understand that oppression, you understand it through the lens of other oppressions. And my feeling when I'm working with schools and districts is nobody gets to be let off the hook for any of these. We're going to discuss all of them. We're going to discuss how they overlap. And if anybody says, well, isn't the real issue class? Isn't the real issue not race? To me, I have a very critical response to that, which is, well, class and poverty are about race. So that it's not even a sensical response. So I try to talk about it intersectionally, and I have issues with some models that kind of refuse to do that.
Okay, well, unfortunately, we have to wrap it up there because we're almost at 1 o'clock. Lots of great questions. We're going to try and respond to some of those following the webcast. We're nearing the end, and I want to just thank all of you for joining us today. We'll follow up with an evaluation with a copy or link to the recording so that you can have access to that, as well as the PowerPoint that was provided as a handout. It's clear to me that we need to bring Paul back. I think as he was talking about all the ways and the advocacy that we need to do, I was kind of cheering here in the background about how we need to stand up for vulnerable populations, especially here in Ontario right at this moment. I want to thank Youth Rex and Katie for all her help today. And also just wanted to remind people that the webcast will be posted. So you can also check out www.spno.ca. And Youth Rex, the website for Youth Rex is www.youthrex.com. Lots of great materials, lots of great resources on both of those websites. And of course, finally, I'd like to thank our incredible guest, mentor, and friend, Paul Gorski, for making the time out of his day for this work, and invite him to come back at another time. So thank you, Paul. We enjoyed it as much as I know everyone did with all the questions and comments that came through. So with that, I will leave you. Have a great afternoon, and make sure to look out for our next webcast in February on private money in public education. Have a great day.